My talk today is Jesus a Christian, a Jew, or a Hindu? It might sound kind of strange, why did I pick this topic? But when I was growing up and my dad was a painter, I would work with him starting at the age of 5, obviously during the summer. And every once in a while he'd say, if a bricklayer lays bricks, does a plumber lay plums? And I didn't know what a plumber was. So it took me maybe 10 years later when he would still say it, if a bricklayer lays bricks, and I saw bricklayers laying bricks, did a plumb layer lays plum? I finally realized that a plumber is another type of a worker. So it made me realize many years later, well, is Jesus a Christian? It had never come to me that he would be a Christian. I just always thought, well, of course he's a Christian because I'm a Christian. So I did a lot of research and found out that there's a vast amount of definitions of who is a Christian, who's a Jew, and who's a Hindu. The Hindu studies came much later, but I wanted to know who was a Christian because I grew up in a family that was Christian, very fundamental Christian. And so we thought, and I was taught, that Christianity is the only thing, everybody else is wrong. But even though we were brought up Christian, we never celebrated Christmas, which put me in a lot of difficulty with my other Christian friends in church and in school. So my family said, well, Christ wasn't born at that time of the year, it was made up. So my little mind said, made up? I wonder what else is made up. So I had a lot of Jewish friends in school because they never asked me, what did you get for Christmas? Because the Jews don't celebrate Christmas. So I felt more akin with the Jews rather than my Christian friends in school. Well, when I was about 15 or so, my mom got me a book on yoga. Now this is very rare because her and my dad were very fundamental. Everything else in the world was incorrect except Christianity. So when she got me a book on yoga, the physical yoga to keep my health, I got hooked. I got addicted. And by the time I finished high school, I'd read 50 books on yoga. So basically this comes down to starting from what is a bricklayer and what is a plumber. Who is Jesus? How did Jesus identify himself? He identified himself as the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He referred to himself a lot as the Son of Man. And so this is what Yogananda said. Yogananda is a great avatar who came over to this country in the 1920s. He wrote the famous book, Autobiography of a Yogi, and he explains this as, the Son of Man hath nowhere to lay his head. Us humans have nowhere to lay our heads. But the avatar's consciousness goes way beyond what we humans lay our head. It's omnipresent. And it took me many years to understand that because there's nothing really in Christianity that explains that. It just takes a very point blank, a very literal explanation of it. So I am going to demonstrate that Jesus' teachings, his higher teachings, do bridge East and West. His literal teachings that the Christian church uses do not. The Christian church officially still insists that it's the only way and every other way is incorrect. But as a yogi, as Yogananda says that Jesus is a yogi, a master yogi, an avatar, they do bridge because yoga is the spiritual yoga is in every tradition. The method of meditation of reflection, of higher states of consciousness, that is all over. That will bridge East and West, not the teachings that the various branches of Christianity teach. That is very different and sometimes, unfortunately, very hostile. So this is what we're going to talk about as an outline: the historical setting. He's a Jew, he's a Christian, he's a Hindu, and then we'll have a discussion. Anytime I'm saying anything, this is very informal. Just stop me and say, "What did you mean by that?" So I'm very happy to. I love maps, and I wanted to show people maps because otherwise it just becomes like, well, you describe this here and that there, but this is a map showing that at the time of Jesus' birth, King Herod ruled Judea, and I think you can see it over there, which was part of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire had conquered practically the whole world, but this little section here is where the part of the Roman Empire where King Herod ruled. Now, I'm going to talk about Jesus first as being a Jew, but just a little historical background. Josephus, who is a famous Jewish historian, they looked to him for like, well, what was going on during the time of Jesus? And so Josephus writes about there are three types of primarily sects in Judaism, which is very small. I mean, if you look at other religious traditions, wow, I mean, you'd have to have 30 slides to even fit them in, and you'd take, 2 weeks to describe it. But for the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes, I just put on a few things here to give you some, to show you some differences. The Sadducees, their belief in afterlife was nothing. Well, to me, I don't know how anybody could be part of a religion if you had no idea or you denied life after death. To me, religion, gives you hope after death or gives you means to it. But the Sadducees says no, none. The Pharisees said, yeah, the resurrection, but we're not really sure about it. And it was only the Essenes that said it was spiritual survival. Now, this is really important because a lot of people think that the resurrection is a physical resurrection. And the great yogis teach that the body is left behind, and then depending upon what branch of yoga you're in, you progress to an astral world, then to a causal world, and then to the beyond that. So it's not a physical resurrection, it is a spiritual resurrection. Now the Essenes, I'll show you later, were influenced they are part of the Gnostics, Gnostic. So they have more of an Eastern understanding, and so they would say a spiritual survival, but yet they were part of the Jewish tradition. And it explains how they interpret their scriptures. Sadducees, literal; Pharisees, scholarly interpretation; the Essenes, inspired exegesis, which can be very tricky for people who are very conservative or are very fundamental. They don't like, people to have the ability to explore. This is what the authorities said, and if you want to stay in our fold, you will follow what the authorities say. To some extent, I'll get to that a little bit later. Okay. I wanted to show you a map, of Alexander invading India to give you an idea that the Western world was not completely devoid of understanding. There was a place called India, and that they had gone there and conquered it. And so King Asoka, who was a Buddhist king in India, 250, way before Christ was born, 250, he had sent missionaries. And many scholars, some debated, some don't, they may have influenced the Greek, these Buddhist missionaries, and therefore influenced the Essenes thinking that I said before. They had a very different idea than the other two sects of Judaism, and I can see where they got it from. The thing that is interesting is that when Alexander the Great went there and he saw a yogi sitting down on the ground, and some Yogananda talks about this, where he goes up to him and he basically says, hey, the king is here, and aren't you going to get up? And he basically, no, he's not the king. I mean, I'm really heavily paraphrasing it, because lots of these ancient writings are debated by scholars. They drive you crazy. A little footnote. I listened to a 2.5-hour lecture by two brilliant biblical scholars. And the theme that they were discussing was, is the Bible historically accurate? And I would thought they'd say yes. Well, one was brought up as a fundamentalist like me, so I could understand where he's coming from. And he said no, and I was surprised. And he was saying, well, I went to the fundamentalist schools, my bachelor's, my master's. When I got to be my PhD, I learned that not everybody agrees that everything in there is correct. So I have to say, as a scholar, it's not correct. The other scholar, equally qualified, is saying, well, you got to remember when things were written many years ago, that they didn't have the same standard as we did. They didn't have Xerox machines. They didn't have, computers. So they would fudge it or they'd make things up. And the other scholar says, no, they didn't make things up. They were just wrong. Well, this went on for 2.5 hours. Finally, at the end, the one scholar who hems and haws said, well, one thing we have to agree on. He's talking to the other scholar. Jesus rose from the dead. So Christianity is true, period. And he walks and sits down. And I thought, no, it means Jesus the Christ is true. It doesn't mean Christianity is true, because there's so many different variations of Christianity. There's so many texts, but I don't want to go into that because that could take 2.5 hours like those scholars were talking about. Basically, though, I want to show you that the West did know about the East. In fact, they invaded it, and they were influenced heavily by Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. First the Buddhists and missionaries, then they went over there, so they're very heavily influenced. Wrong button. Here's something I just wanted to show, because people now are on the interstates or on roads, they take airplanes, but I always used to think, well, how did they get from place to place? There were established routes. It's not like they didn't know how to get there. They had these routes that were traveled for commerce, basically, because people want things from other parts of the world. So when they go over to other parts of the world and it's well established, obviously they talk to people and they say, oh, what do you believe? Do you believe in my God, the Jupiter? And they say, whatever. So the influence of commerce and philosophical religious ideas flowed back and forth. You can see a huge part of what was going on. Now, this is to say that he was a Jew. When I grew up, I never thought of Jesus as a Jew. I thought of him as a Christian. Well, he was born in Bethlehem, but his parents moved back to Nazareth. That's why sometimes he's referred to as Jesus of Nazareth. It's a little tricky, but they say he was born in Bethlehem, moved back to Nazareth. He didn't come to start a new religion, because right in the Bible, Jesus is saying, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Now, the law in Judaism is the Torah. That's the first 5 books of their Bible, so to speak, and the prophets are the rest. So Jesus is referring to the Torah, which is very holy to them. I don't know if the equivalent would be the Vedas, but it's very, very intrinsic in their doctrines. And the prophets are like explaining other things. The basis is the Torah, and then maybe it's like the Vedas and the Upanishads, I'm not sure. But it's a standard, so he's saying, I didn't come to destroy all that and start a new religion. I came to fulfill it, meaning later at some point he says, not one jot or tittle will fall until this is established. So he's saying, I agree, this is very important. I'm not trying to destroy it. Now, evidence that Jesus is a Jew is his disciples referred to him as rabbi, which is a Jewish term, which means teacher of the Torah, the first 5 books of their scriptures, which are the law. It's either called the Pentateuch, or it's called the Torah, or it's called the law. And after he left, some of the people who followed his teachings, they were called outlier sects of Judaism, because they had different ways of interpreting it. Various sects believes various things. The Ebionites, they believe Jesus was the Messiah, but not divine. The other one said Jesus was the Messiah and God, but the Torah was law. Once again, that's established is the law. And the Essenes, they believed in immortality and divine punishment. So they had a lot of competition going on in the Jewish world. And you'll see how that ties over to the Christian world. Competition was so fierce in the Christian world, the winners won, and they wrote the history. Okay, that happens all over, but most people don't know there was vast competition. And so this one scholar was saying, well, how do we know this actually happened? Well, Josephus, the very famous historian I mentioned about, he wrote on Jesus. And so they know a historian said this person existed. He didn't go into anything else or much else, but that's what he said. And Jesus spoke in the Jewish temple, and you would not have been allowed in there unless you were Jewish. So knowing that in Judaism, where Jesus, he lived in the country and he was part of it, had this conflict, a lot of people don't know that the same conflict, even greater, occurred at the beginning of the Christian era. And the Emperor Constantine declared Christianity to be the state religion. This helped the Christians who were following Jesus for centuries, but were sometimes persecuted and all sorts of things. So the emperor comes along and says, no, you can't persecute them anymore. And so that gave them the freedom to really then take charge and grow. And the Bible, as we know, wasn't assembled to 382, which surprised me when I was a teenager. I thought the disciples directly in Jesus wrote it, and that would have been like at the latest 30 AD, but there are lots of other people, as I'll show you later, that wrote things about what Jesus said that did not get included. This council decided what went in there and decided what should be destroyed, not just, like put some other place, absolutely destroyed. And I'll show you how fortunately we found what they tried to destroy. Now here's the evidence that people say Jesus is Christian, because the Catholics, there's many branches of Christianity, just basically 6 major branches, and then it goes to 28,000. You go crazy to try and figure it out. But the Catholics say that Jesus said, and he did, thou art Peter, Petros in Greek, and on this rock, Petra, I will build my church. So they say, see, Jesus wanted to establish a church. Well, I'm not going to go into here, but I wrote a book describing this great detail, that what I believe it actually means. But anyway, that's what they say, and people followed it and believed it. And so then we come to where people say, and every Christian scholar says that the Bible is completely, that's why I bolded, completely, inexplicably silent about Jesus' life from 12 to 30. That's very important, because otherwise how can I say that Jesus is a Hindu, okay? Saying only that as the child grew and waxed in spirit and was in the desert till the day of his showing. Well, for 18 years he was missing, all right? And they say there's no reference whatsoever. I look at this one verse where it says, he was in the deserts. Well, it does say where he went, like he went to Minnesota. It doesn't say he went to Bemidji or to Maple Grove. It just says he went to Minnesota. It doesn't say specifically when. So they say, no, he just vaguely, it's so not completely silent, but it's very vague, this in the deserts. So taking my clue as on that, I said, okay, there's got to be more follow-up information. Just to go back to some historical reference again with the map, okay, we have the Persian Royal Road built by Darius the Great. Darius lived 550 to 486 BC. So very early, you can see that once again, there was routes going back and forth. It wasn't like they stayed here, and nobody knew each other, nobody talked to each other. There's a tremendous amount of talk and intercultural change besides commercial change, tremendous amount going on. I just wanted to show you that it existed. Now, here's where I pull in the historical reference or geographical reference. Routes between Israel and India were already established for regional commerce called the Silk Road. The Silk Road gets its name from the fact that the Chinese civilization had silk, and it was in great demand for the royalty. Now, about 200 BC, well before Jesus was born, this route was established. So there was contact by the route. It took about 2 years, they said, traveling to get to there. So it's entirely possible, I'm not saying it actually happened, I will later say that, entirely possible for somebody to take the round trip 1 year to a certain place and then take the caravan route back. You didn't have to do it by yourself, you didn't have to put your backpack on, you know. There were routes established that had camels and so forth and so on. So it was possible. So if Jesus had wanted to go to the east, because he had heard earlier from the talkings of the Buddhist missionaries, this is interesting, okay? He could have done it. It's not impossible. When I was growing up, I never knew about this, and I thought, well, if he did want to get there, how did he get there? You know, go across rivers and streams and whatever. And this route does go through 2 different deserts, and I thought, aha, maybe that's what the reference was, deserts, plural, not singular, but plural. So I use this as another key in the puzzle. And some say, and I'll show you very shortly, that he spent the years in India, up in the northern part of India, studying with yogis and preparing for his difficult mission. Well, it was very difficult. Now, here is a picture of the Hinduist monastery in Kashmir, okay? Jesus, this is in the Bible again, once again, where he says, other sheep I have which are not of this fold. He's in Israel saying, I have other sheep which are not of this fold, meaning I have other disciples. They're not here. But he doesn't say where they are. And maybe he did, and maybe he was deleted. But he's saying, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. Now, this monastery in Kashmir says they have records that Jesus once stayed there. The reason why I put in parentheses Isa is because in all of these records he's referred to as Isa, I-S-S-A, Jesus, Isa, but the Muslims call Jesus, besides calling him the son of Mary, in the Quran, Jesus is called many more times the son of Mary, and then the other times he's called Isa. That's how, I don't know what the connection is, but in the manuscripts they say that Isa stayed there. This was like, wow, really? The fact that Jesus spent time there and was influenced by the concepts and philosophical concepts, I'm just giving you a brief little example of it, where he says, ye are gods, John 10:34. Just about very few Christians ever know that verse, because it would shatter their orthodox or conservative view that we can't be gods, but notice it's small g. Well, in the East, the soul is a type of a god, the Atman, not the body. And so that fits in with what Jesus is saying. Whatsoever man sows, so shall he reap. Obviously, a reference to karma. And not that karma only comes from there. Other philosophies talked about it. So I'm just giving you some points of where Jesus says, turn the other cheek, which is ahimsa. The Ajna chakra, which shows very, very direct yogic influence and yogic explanation. He says, if thine eye be single, thy whole body will be full of light. That's a very difficult thing for Christians to describe, because what is he talking about? The Sila? What? I forgot that. The guy with the one eye?
Shiva.
The what?
Shiva.
No, I don't mean in India.
Yes.
I mean the mythology.
Cyclops.
Cyclops.
Cyclops, you know? So some people thought, oh, he was referring to the Cyclops in Greek mythology, which had the one eye, not the Shiva, yeah. But no, this is, if you know anything about yoga, this is very, very easy to see the direct connection. When the third eye opens up, as the great yogis talk about, you pierce into the astral world, even further into the causal world and beyond. So Jesus is saying, hey, when this happens, your whole body is full of light. You will see your whole body shimmering as energy and light. It doesn't make sense to most Christians. In fact, I try to see what most Christians say about that, and they sort of hem and haw because it's such a direct reference. Reincarnation, this is another difficult part for Christianity. Reincarnation was one of the competing theories and concepts in early Christianity. About the 4th century, they decided to get rid of it. Who's the they? The victors, the winners. And they destroyed all the other records. They said that the other Christian sects that didn't agree with them were, like pagans and so forth. So when you come to this point, they say, well, where does it refer to as reincarnation in the Bible? Well, they don't use that term reincarnation, but this is a reference also. He that overcometh, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. And here's the important part. He shall go out no more. Well, what could that mean? If you know yoga, it means you won't recycle. Again, you won't go out again and again and again from the astral, the earth and the astral and the earth, and so forth. So he's saying, when you overcome, this is what you do. You will not have to reincarnate. Yoga is very specific on how to do that. You will not reincarnate. And in fact, it's very interesting. I haven't yet made a link one-to-one, and I will. But he that overcometh, in the beginning of Revelations, it says you have to overcome 8 things. So he's very specifically saying, and Revelations is a really, really difficult book in the Bible. It's the last book there. And he says there's 8 things. If you can achieve that, you don't have to reincarnate anymore. Evidence that he's a Hindu is not in the Synoptic Gospels, which are, the 4 Gospels. But there are other Gospels written about Jesus. They were destroyed by the Catholic bishops. Obviously, they're in a fight. They want to get rid of the competition. So they just destroyed them, and they thought this was taken care of. 1945, they discovered in Nag Hammadi, if you can see way down there, they discovered in Nag Hammadi what they call the Nag Hammadi text or the Gnostic Gospels. And in there is the stuff that was destroyed, very karmically propitious, I think. It had a reason to be kept there and only found in 1945, because I would imagine if it had been found before 1945, we wouldn't even be talking about it now. It would be destroyed again. Now, a lot of people talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are very important. The Dead Sea Scrolls, though, only confirm the Jewish scriptures. They don't confirm what the early Christian scriptures. These are the texts, Nag Hammadi texts that talk about early Christianity. This is where we have an entirely different view of Jesus. For instance, this is just a part of the Nag Hammadi text. In the Gospel, it's called the Gospel of Thomas. I disclose my mysteries to those who are worthy of my mysteries. Well, it's like a guru saying, if you aren't worthy or ready, I'm not going to give you stuff you're not ready for. You have to be worthy or ready. So Jesus is saying that. Well, in Christianity, they say everybody gets it, it's free and I tell you how to do it. No, Jesus is saying, because he's influenced by the yogis and the Eastern tradition, if you are ready, I'll give it to you. He also talks about the soul and hence of the body. But to me, this is the key point here. Now, when Jesus says, I and my Father are one, we all know how Orthodox Christianity teaches that Jesus is God. Okay? But what I'm saying is, Tat Famasi means thou art that. In other words, our true essence is the essence of reality. Not that I am the reality, my essence. I am made in the image of God, it says in Genesis. So if I'm made in the image of God, It doesn't come from a book, or it doesn't come from a mountain. I mean, in the image, so I have to have part of that essence. So when Jesus says, "I, my Father, are one," that's what he's meaning. He's taking it from what he studied in India, where it says, "Thou art that." And words are sometimes very difficult, and especially if you have none of the background that India has on this for thousands and thousands of years. Jesus is reintroducing this. Moses talked about this, but it was basically lost until Jesus said, "I've got to reestablish this." Now, these are many of the Hindu swamis that say he's a Hindu or that he is a great yogi. So it's not just one person saying it. Now, we're back to, is Jesus a Christian, Jew, or Hindu? How did Jesus himself identify himself, okay? So he says, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And so his disciples say, well, maybe John the Baptist, maybe Elias, which is the Greek word for Elijah, which is the famous Jewish prophet. Others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And then he says to Peter, but say ye that I am. And so Peter says, which is misunderstood, "Thou art Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, another whole talk could just be about the difference Yogananda says between Jesus and Jesus the Christ. The Christ is the anointing. The Christ is the descending of the cosmic consciousness. So when they say Jesus the Christ, they're referring to this man who has the Christ consciousness Yogananda talks about. If you talk about Jesus, it's the Son of Man. Jesus the Christ has attained that cosmic consciousness. And Christ in Greek means anointing. And what they did for the kings and the prophets, they anointed them. Like many Hindu traditions are anointing to give the blessing. Okay? This is something that was very much understood by Jesus and his disciples, but it's completely lost on the Western understanding of it. Okay. He did bridge the East because he spent part of his life in Israel, part in India, and he introduced these concepts. And I've just said before, it was in the Gnostic Gospels, they destroyed it. Fortunately, it was rediscovered in 1945. I didn't go into much about the book. Do I have it here? There's a book that I read that talks about this Russian explorer who goes to Ladakh in 1894. And he finds up in this monastery, Himis, that I showed a picture of, manuscripts which actually say this is what he studied, this is what he did. And those swamis that I'd shown before, a lot of them had gone up there and said, yes, the manuscripts do exist, yes, they refer to this, because of course in 1894, very different mindset. And so his book was attacked viciously. No, he's crazy, never happened. We went and talked to those people and they said, no, I don't know where this guy came. He's making up all this stuff. It can't be. Well, slew of those yogis and other people who were professors went to the monastery and said, yes, it is there. And in fact, in India at the time that it was published, the British government, being a Christian nation, said to people, you go around and get these manuscripts. Of course, they never could get them because they're up in monasteries and they won't let anybody in there. But get the copies of his book and bring them to us, and they destroyed them. Because they didn't want this to get out. Just like they didn't want the Gospel of Thomas that Jesus talks in get out, which was destroyed. But fortunately, it was rediscovered in 1945. So this is some of the resources. There's tons and tons of resources. I don't know if there's a film which you can see on YouTube. Jesus is in India, and the Lost Years of Jesus by Richard Bach. And those will give you a long, detailed, not like as much of the philosophical concepts I'm giving you here, but you'll get a sense for how could it be possible. Now, I save this here for last because it's very interesting. Did anybody know here about Bhagavan Sri Satya Sai Baba? Sai Baba in India. Some people, I wanted to see him, but some people say he's a fake, some people say he's great. I like everything. But he had okay. He has some disciples that come from all over the world to meet him. Okay, and he would take him into the room for an interview, and he produced, I don't know if he would produce objects right out of the air, and I've seen him produce that, you know, and healed people, all sorts of things. So he had some very close disciples that were from England. They came over to visit him. They came into the room where he gave them an interview, and meanwhile, the man puts his camera in the back and goes sits up in the front, and Sai Baba's talking to them, and he hears his camera clicking. He's thinking, what's going on? But he's not upset because he knows Sai Baba does all sorts of things. So goes back to England, and he develops the film. And this is the film that comes out. And he goes back to India again, and he says to Sai Baba, who is this man? And Sai Baba says, this is how Jesus looked when he was 28 before he started on his trip back to Israel. Now, he didn't draw it, he didn't materialize it, the camera was clicking away, and Sai Baba put this picture on there. That's way beyond quantum physics to be able to do, and this is just a little thing of what Sai Baba's done. But I thought a great spiritual leader in India has this, materializes this to show his English disciple, yes, Jesus lived, yes, Jesus was in India, yes, this is a photograph, not a drawn picture, a photograph of what Jesus looked like when he was 28 years old, before he traveled back to India. Okay, so now I'm opening it up to all sorts of questions. I spent many decades studying this. I'm trying to summarize decades of research and work and analysis and putting things together as a short little summary. I wrote a book. If anybody's interested, I have 2 or 3 copies here, but you can get it on Amazon. But I want to open it up to discussion because I know I may have presented a lot of things that people are saying it's crazy or never heard about this, or so. Any questions you have?
This is very interesting. I'm part of an interfaith group in college run.
Interfaith group, right, yeah.
We're meeting today this evening.
Now, that interfaith is very interesting because it's trying to resolve a conflict between religions. Not much is talked about intra-faith, which is the conflict within a religion, and just about nobody talks about the interfaith conflict, which we all have. What is my identity? Is it a you know, who are you? Are you a bookkeeper? Are you a laborer? Are you a professor? You know, are you old, young? So nobody talks about that conflict that we have interfaith. And I remember very clearly in New York City one time, many years ago, a little boy was sitting on the bench and I sat down next to him. He looks at me and I was reading a book. He says, who are you? And I turned to him and I said, I'm a nobody. Who are you? And it's like, we all have to deal with those 3 levels. Interfaith, who am I? What's my real identity? And how do we get along with the denominations within our religion? And how do we get along with the major differences between religions? Yeah.
The question was that how can we Hindus make better relationship with Christians?
That's why I spent a lot of time with the Hindu section. And some people are saying, well, why spend a lot of time in the Hindu section? I said, because first of all, it's in the Hindu temple, and I'm very appreciative I got to speak here. And I want to go over, okay, what are these concepts? Now, that brings up another part of my studies, which I have in my book, okay? in every tradition, I say that there's three types of followers. There's the literalists who say, I'm right, too bad, you're wrong. And then there are the allegorists who say, well, this means that. It doesn't mean literally this. He's trying to describe something. And then in every tradition, very small part, are the esoteric or the mystics. And they are saying metaphysically, what does it mean, when he says, I am God? Well, the literist said, he literally means it. The allegorical will say, no, it means he's saying that, I'm one with him. And the esoterics and mystics will say, when your identity, your real identity is established, you can then say, I am part of the ocean. I am not the ocean, but I'm part of it. Clear definition would be where the Word of God for the exoterics, it's the Bible. The Word of God for the people in the middle who you can agree with more. Don't try to agree with the exoterics. The Word of God is the Bible. Word of God for the mesoteric, they'll say it's anything that teaches peace, love, companionship, and all of the good qualities. The esoteric, the very small part of every tradition, and it took me decades to realize this, say the Word of God is the vibration that caused the creation. It's like, wow, is that different? So you can talk to the esoteric and you can interact with the allegoricals, but you would have a rough road to hoe if you want to talk with the conservative. They will not talk with you, they will preach to you, right? So you can't look upon them to establish it, but they even look at the Gnostic Gospels. Well, it can't be because it's not the Bible. Where do you go from that? The scholars, though, will say, okay, this is part of the tradition. This is definitely Jesus talking here, but it hasn't been accepted in the canon. The scholars have to say, what do we do with it? They're not like the conservative Catholics, Protestant, Anglican, Russian Orthodox, and so forth. They say, we've got to deal with it. That's your best bet, I would say, is talk to people like in the Muslim tradition, that's a Sufi tradition. You talk in Judaism to the people who are studying the Kabbalah. You talk to the Christians who are more understanding of the inner meaning of Jesus. And so that way you can establish like a community of very similar, very like-minded. You could also have a lot of success with the people who say, well, the Word of God is like peace, love, charity, and so forth. They will have an understanding, and they will be people you could really relate to. I would just suggest don't butt heads with the people. I was one of those people you would have butted heads with when I was a teenager, and I know it's like, wow, locked in there. Yeah. So that's my suggestion. Have you found that out to be true?
Well, I'm invited to talk about Hinduism in a very liberal settings.
In a very what?
Liberal. So very open.
Very open, yes.
Like Oxford College.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
So the students, they are pretty open-minded, very open-minded.
And then you can discuss and talk with them. And either side are not trying to convince the other side, yeah, come over to my side. You just say, wow, isn't it great? We have similarly minded people. It's like a garden. There's all sorts of flowers in the garden. And a rose doesn't try to turn a lily into a lily or vice versa. We appreciate the various flowers that are in that garden. And unfortunately, without mentioning anything other than there's also weeds in the garden. And I don't know how you deal with the weeds, but there are weeds in the garden, and they are not the flowers. They don't produce any good fruit or lovely, ambiance. So there is a verse in the Bible, the last verse of the Gospel of John. where basically Jesus, well, they're talking about Jesus and saying that all the things that he did were to be written down. I don't think the world could contain the books. And yet we have this small little version. If this is God, and we have only small little version, that's ridiculous. So at the very end of John, the very last verse in it says, and if we were to record and write about all these things, you couldn't contain it. Which to me makes much more sense. I could still think of Jesus as God, because he would have done all these different things. But to say, no, these are the only records we have, everything else is wrong. Nobody could say anything until 1945, when out comes this manuscripts. 52 manuscripts were discovered. And the scholars went nuts. They said, wow, we heard about them, but of course, the people who won the battle would say, oh, they say this, they say that. They never had the manuscripts. Now they have them. And so there's a tremendous amount of research going on in that. You know. So just not to confuse the two, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which confirm Judaism, and the Nag Hammadi, or the Gnostic Gospels, which confirm Jesus did say other things that were deleted. Yes?
I have one totally different question. Why do Christians call Jesus a son of God and not God itself?
Why do they call him a son of God?
Yeah, and not God itself.
Well, a lot of Christians say he is God, but they also say he's the son of God. Okay? Now, here's where it becomes difficult without going into another long talk, but there's many things. When he gets baptized, a voice comes from heaven and says, this is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. So he's called the beloved son, okay, which son, you can call him a son of God. And in other passages, it says that for God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son, okay? So they look at that verse and it goes on. He's the only begotten son. Yogananda says the only begotten son of God is the only ray coming from the unmanifested essence, reality. And so he sent his only begotten. Only begotten in Greek means self-born. Doesn't mean virgin, but it's self-born. The infinite projected one ray, Yogananda says, into the cosmos. And it wasn't like into the world. If you look up the Greek word for, God so loved the world, it's God so loved the cosmos. I said, wow, that makes much more sense. He didn't just love this puny little planet, fighting and scrapping and everything. There are 2 trillion galaxies. So if the divine created everything, he wouldn't just put all of the energy and attention on one minute speck and leave the rest of the creation totally whatever. So Yogananda says when it says God so loved the cosmos, he sent his one ray into this creation so that there was a connection. And the rest of the verse says God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth him should not perish but have everlasting life. He's saying if you want to have everlasting life, you've got to make connection with this only begotten son, this Christ consciousness, the Chaitanya that Yogananda talks about. It is a universal concept, but the Western world didn't have all this background. It was all missing from them. So they had to say, well, he meant we're the supreme, we're the most powerful, he's the God, nobody else is. It's kind of a shame, it's kind of sad, because they didn't have a lot of this background that they totally misunderstood what Jesus was talking about. So, I can't argue with people like that. Their background is, when I was in school and they said, 3, you have 4 and you take away 3. What is it? Well, 1. 5, take away 2. Well, what is it? 3. How about 2 take away 5? You can't do it. What do you mean you can't? Well, you'll learn that later. Well, it's like that. This is the moment for 2 minus 5. You can't do it. When you learn mathematics, you learn many things. When you learn the yoga tradition and the yoga metaphysics, it's like just umpteen worlds open up to you. Yeah. And that's what I say is the link of Jesus between the East and the West. He comes over with a yogic message. The one to me which is so revealing is that thine eye be single, thy whole body will be full of light. How can you explain it any other way? Well, if you don't know yoga and meditation, you can explain it 25 different ways, but to me, you're not explaining what Jesus meant. Did that answer? Yeah.
One question. When you say you studied the scriptures, so what is the list of scriptures which are there in your Christian tradition?
What's the number of scriptures I've studied? Well, I haven't studied them in detail, but all the world's religion scriptures. Obviously, I couldn't even begin to study the Hindu scriptures. I would have to take many lifetimes, But, the Bhagavad Gita and some of the Vedas for Hinduism, a lot of what the yogis say about the scriptures, the Upanishads and so forth. But in the West, it's easy to read the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures, and the Quran's easy to read. The Zenavesta, which is Zoroastrians, that's relatively short. I love the Tao Te Ching because of all the scriptures, it's the shortest. It's only 5,000 Chinese characters. And so when I heard that, I thought, hey, I'm going to learn Chinese so I can read the whole thing in Chinese. Well, I didn't get very far, but I thought, wow, this is the shortest scriptures in the world, the Tao Te Ching. And so I've studied quite a wide range of them and also relied upon the experts in those fields to tell me, like what's going on. For instance, just give you a little hint. I read 7 different versions of what the Quran means in this day I have chosen for you Islam. So 5 of the Arabic scholars say, this day I, meaning Allah, I have chosen for you Islam. You got to be a Muslim then. The other 2 scholars say, wait a minute, there's some variation on the translation. And it's more like, this day I have approved Islam for you. Well, if I have chosen an apple for you, you better well take it. But I've proved it for you, it's up to you. And I thought, wow, that just like in every tradition, how you know the meaning of the language at that time has a wide version, Another one is like when the Christians talk about the end of the world. I don't know if you meet many with Christians. The end of the world, the end times is going to all end. Well, in the Greek, Jesus doesn't say the end of the world. In the Greek, it says the end of the age. Duh, if one age ends, another age is going to start. You don't have the sense of dread and doom and everything. And so little words that are mistranslated like, wow, so very, very different.
Another question, the story of Noah. And
In a what?
Story of Noah.
Noah.
Oh, Noah, yes, yeah.
And the Matsya avatar, which is the first avatar of Vishnu. That's the same. I mean,
Oh, you're bringing the parallel.
yes.
Yes, yeah.
It's the same story. So how come that is included in Christianity? That's something I wonder.
I think sometimes, and as Sadhguru would say, I don't mean to insult anybody. He says this all the time because he's a powerful guru, Sadhguru. So I don't mean to insult anybody, but they're very particular about saying this is ours. I talked with a very good Christian friend a number of years ago. He'd say, well, Ralph, Jesus is the best. I said, yeah. Okay, so he did this, and that. Well, the yogis are doing, the great yogis, they get the permission from the divine and they do miracles. Okay, Satya Sai Baba did so many miracles, you'd have to have a book this thick, and I've experienced some of those. They're absolutely amazing. So that then it's important, and I'm not trying to knock them for that. But they think nobody else did these miracles. And so one day she says to me, well, Jesus Christ raised Lazarus from the dead. I said, I won't mention her name. Well, other yogis have raised people from the dead. She's like, wow. And she said, a couple of weeks later, she said, but one thing that Christ did that nobody else did, he was resurrected. I said, I hate to tell you this, but other people have resurrected, and they have witnesses said it, which left her in a quandary, because she couldn't say, well, those witnesses are false, because I would say, your witnesses are false. So I wanted her to realize all of her Love for her religion is based upon certain things, but don't knock another religion because you say they don't have it, because lo and behold, they do have it. But you haven't heard about it, and you're told not to explore it because it's dangerous for your soul. Your soul is in danger. I lived that the first 15 years of my life. My soul was in danger. The way I got around it, okay, I know they'll be recorded, but the way I got around it, I was saved. I was sure I was saved. So I could go and explore other things, because even if I got lost in the other religions, I was still saved. My soul was saved. I had to use this programming to get out of my vicious programming to explore other traditions. I mean, I can understand where people are at when I talk to fundamentalists. I was there. I understand it exactly. And I understand how very difficult it is to get out of it. And that happens in everyday life. We have a routine, we have a mindset, and until somebody reminds us, hey, we think it's obviously natural. Until somebody says, oh, well, I don't eat with a fork, I eat with my hands. We just think that's the way everybody does it, with a fork or with their hands. So yeah, they don't want to give up anything, you know. In fact, they try to say, well, look at the story of Noah or the flood. It shows it because it's another tradition. What they forget to say is the other traditions are thousands of years older. And like they'll say other things like, well, try to think of another one. Oh yeah, this is one of my favorites that I learned about. The 10 Commandments, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. I love the yamas and niyamas, because it's basically saying what a rational person would say, thou shalt not and thou shalt. Reality is a dualistic thing. Don't do this and do this. So I don't, don't do this, don't do this, thou shalt not. That was about maybe 1300 BC. The Code of Hammurabi was at least 500 years older, and it was a code of ethics. The Jewish tradition doesn't have the only code of ethics in the world. If they have it, fine, but don't try and say, we have the only one, we have the only right one. That, once again, is talking to the exoteric literalist. You can't talk with him, you can't argue with him, because you're wrong, and I'm right. Yeah, so all my life I've tried to talk with people who are more in the middle group, because they're really looking. They're not locked in, and they're really looking. What is this about life? Why did I come here? How did I get here? What's my purpose in life? Where am I going? And if you take the standard answers, fine. If you're happy with that, if you progress, you love people, if you love God, you love neighbor, love self, fine. But when it starts getting into, I gotta hate my neighbor, God I'm afraid of, and I'm a sinner, totally, totally wrong in my view. Because, it's at the beginning of wisdom. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. I looked up the word fear, like I look up everything. It's the reverence towards God. Very different. If I fear you versus I revere you, I'm going to have a possibility to love you. I can't love you if I fear you.
So what you just said, so when I give these talks, they talk about the difference between Christianity and Hinduism. So in Christianity, as I understand it, I know very little.
Of Christianity, you mean?
Yeah. I understand very little.
We could be a good team.
Maybe.
I know just a little.
So
we could be a very good team.
Right. So in Christianity, virgin birth is very important.
Well, yes, it's very important, but did they know that in Buddhism, the same thing? Mara, the elephant, that's a virgin birth. And Satya Sai Baba, his mother was born by a light that penetrated her body. So in that sense, it was a virgin birth. It's not just unique, but until you point out to people that these are in other traditions, they think, oh, I'm exclusive, whereas the yogis are inclusive, and the very small, narrow people are very exclusive. Everybody else is wrong. But the yogis and the mystics and the poets, they're very inclusive. We're all on this planet together. And your story, it might be unique, or it may be found in another place. It doesn't mean your story is right and theirs is wrong or whatever. It means these stories are there because people are searching and seeking. Is there anything universal? And that's why I wrote my book, and I entitled it, Love God, Love Neighbor, Love Self. That covers everything. Not fear God, not hate your neighbor and think you're a sinner, but love God, love neighbor, love self. And so that, to me, sums it up, and that's what the spiritual genius of Jesus was. He summed it up in 2 commandments. I just made it 3 to make it easier, because he says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. And, second one, love thy neighbor as thyself. I just said, okay, love thy neighbor, and self should be distinguished, okay? And then he says, upon this hang all the law and the prophet. He's saying on these 2 things that I've talked about, hang all the 613 mitzvahs, 613 commandments they had in the Jewish scripture. How can you even take care of 20, let alone 613? He's saying, I gave it to you too. If you can do this, that's it. So, and so I have my cards here if you want to take it and, email me about anything. And I just have a few of 2 or 3 of my books here if anybody wants to buy it. Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Yeah,
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.